Hello, ADM630. Welcome to this video on Chapter 7, Quantitative Data Collection Techniques. And as with all the other videos, I'm going to hit the high points and share my general thoughts of what I think are the most important points. And so we're going to start with validity as a measurement of, in terms of measurement sensitivity. And validity is all about making sure that the constructs that form a data collection instrument that is quantitative in nature are actually measuring what's intended. And this is important because if a researcher is using an instrument to collect data, but that instrument is not actually addressing the constructs that frame the research, then it's not a valid study. And so as you read articles that you're pulling for your MRP and as you go through your programs, you're going to notice validity and reliability, which I'll address next, mentioned in pretty much every article that is quantitative. And now reliability is really asking about largely the relationship between items in an instrument. And so if a research article says that the instrument was found to be reliable, that means that the researcher did an analysis after data was collected to look at the agreement across items. And so it's really looking to, as we can see here, if it's a scale-based approach, are all the points on the scale used? So the example shown here is it yes, no choices or some sort of range between yes and no, or are the choices clearly identified and aligned with specific numbers in the scale? Now we're going to get into some different forms of data collection for quantitative studies. And one of the primary things that we see, particularly in experimental studies, is the use of tests. And tests are used largely to assess an individual's ability to complete some cognitive task or set of cognitive tasks. And we see these where the answers are summarized, obviously in numerical scores, because this is quantitative that we're talking about today. And one thing that's important to remember about the use of tests is that they measure performance at the time that a test is given. And so it's not some sort of absolute that Johnny got a score of 87 out of 100 on this test, and so that means that Johnny is always going to perform at that 87% level. Although oftentimes I think we usually interpret cognitive tests in that way, but we need to recognize that there is an element of time that comes into play. And there are two different approaches to looking at scores that come from these types of tests. One is criterion referenced, which would be known as standards based. And so this is how does an individual perform relative to some established level. So there's some sort of base score that has been normed. And so we're going to get into normative scoring in Chapter 7. And then we also see this oftentimes related to did the individual pass, demonstrate proficiency, or are they advanced? And so think about standards-based testing in education. And then we also have norm referenced or reference group tests. And so with norm reference groups, it's all about performance relative to other individuals with similar characteristics who take that test and provide that data. And we see large-scale standardized tests. And large-scale standardized tests can be either norm-referenced or they can be standards-based. And so it's all about how are the results analyzed, but then also how are they reported. And so if you read something for research that you do that relates to standardized testing, you will sometimes see results reported based on a reference group. So how did individuals from this school perform compared to individuals from other schools? So for example, how do students in Callaway County perform in both the Callaway County and the Murray Independent School Districts perform on the ACT relative to all of the other school districts or all the other counties in the Commonwealth of Kentucky? And so with large-scale standardized tests, we have uniform procedures for administration and scoring, and this is done in an effort to reduce some different types of error that can come about with quantitative data collection. And tests are prepared by measurement experts. If we look at most large-scale standardized tests, they're largely constructed by folks who have degrees in statistics or have degrees in educational research at the doctoral level and are really considered experts in measurement. So that means that we don't necessarily have people who are experts in the content area of the tests. Well, that doesn't mean that those folks are just making things up related to content. People who are developing and rewriting these large-scale standardized tests are consulting with experts in those content area fields. We also have standards-based tests, and we see these related to licensure and certification. And sometimes the lines between all these different types of tests do get blurred. So if we think about the praxis, for example, which is required for student teachers before they're able to complete their student teaching and then go on for certification in the state in which they reside. The praxis is a large-scale standardized test, but it's also a standards-based test because the test itself is constructed around a set of standards for teaching, and the scores are reported as proficient or not proficient, but they're also reported based on percentiles. And so then we think about the standardized achievement tests, such as the ACT. And so one of the points about standardized achievement tests is that they are commercially developed. And so the ACT is developed and administered by ETS, Educational Testing Services. And so you can see a note here on this slide that standardized achievement tests are norm referenced and criterion referenced, and in both of those bases of scores are reported. So if we think about norm reference scores, it's about determining the standard score and then where an individual score deviates from the mean. And so we get the score and then the standard deviation. And Macmillan spent some time talking about z-scores and how to calculate z-scores and what that tells us. When I took the equivalent of ADM630 in my master's program, we actually spent a lot of time calculating z-scores. Now that I teach this course, I'm not really sure what the purpose of that was because in further coursework that I've taken and then research that I've done, I've actually not calculated any z-scores. But when we think about how scores are reported and before that, how we interpret those scores, there is an element of z-score that comes into play. Although with the use of software, a lot of that z-score element is actually done in the background, and then the output that we get through the quantitative software helps us interpret it based on standard deviation. So we're not having to spend our time kind of thinking about what the z-score means, and how do we interpret it. Some examples of grade equivalency or grade equivalence based on norm reference scores would be looking at, again, how individuals are attempting to predict how an individual compares with a nationally normed group. So one of the ways that we might use this type of prediction element right here is thinking about or looking at past data and making a comparison and then kind of looking at doing a forecast in terms of the trend. So let's take Murray Independent School District. We've seen that Murray Independent has historically outperformed the state average. And so with all things remaining equal and looking at other trend data, we might be able to predict that that trend will continue based on other elements that we're seeing out of Murray Independent. And one of the things when it comes to interpreting mean scores, so let's say that we have a 5-point scale and we see a score of 5.0, and it doesn't mean that we should interpolate this 5.0 to mean that, and this is an example that Macmillan uses in Chapter 7, that a student in the 5th grade should know as much as any other 5th grader, or that a student at a lower grade scores a 5.0 on some sort of evaluation measure that's as norm referenced, and a 5.0 tells us that a student should be is performing at a 5th grade level, that we shouldn't use that as a basis for then moving that student into the 5th grade. So the Macmillan gets into questionnaires. And we generally think of these in terms of surveys, where we're trying to assess non-cognitive traits such as student or individual attitudes, beliefs, and values. And these can be very useful as a way to get information. And in education, particularly in my field of higher education, we see questionnaires used and surveys used quite frequently as a means of gathering information from students, faculty, parents, and other stakeholders. And it's a way for us to take the pulse. How are people feeling? Are people satisfied? Do people feel that they're getting the education that they're paying for? Do students feel that they're getting the services and experiences that they're paying for? Do students feel connected to each other? And a wide range of things that we want to know about when we are setting up programs and services. And it becomes a really good way for institutions, or one way that institutions use to gather information about how other people think that we're doing. We also see personality assessments. Again, personality assessments are, we might often want to try to lump them as being cognitive measures, but really a personality assessment is generally asking about preferences and things of that nature. So I think about the Myers-Briggs personality assessment or the Strengths Quest assessment, where the questions are largely framed about our preferences for working with other people, our preferences for processing information, for gathering information, for making decisions. And so because of that, they're non-cognitive, but they do address some cognitive characteristics, but really it's our own individual perceptions of those cognitive characteristics. So again, we're concerned with preferences, and we could see any type of scales that are used. It might be, or any type of approach to gathering that information. So largely we see a scale in terms of please indicate your agreement with the following statement. Or we might even see a comparison of these two statements. Which do you feel most reflects your preference? And there might actually be a scale under it to completely choice 1 or completely choice 2, somewhere in between. We might see checklists. Please identify all the items that you find satisfying in your work. Or we might ask an individual to rank order their preferences. And so here are some examples of some scales. We see Likert, and I know it looks like Likert, but it is actually pronounced Likert. And a traditional Likert scale is what's shown in this first choice, with strongly agree to strongly disagree. You'll notice that in this range of the traditional Likert scale, there's no neutral. And I'm a big fan of not having a neutral option. I find that we get stronger data and much more usable data when there's what's called a forced choice. And then we have what's known as Likert type scales, which is a scale that's based on the strongly agree to strongly disagree scale, but with some different wording, and could include something that's akin to a neutral. So here in this scale, good, we could potentially interpret that as neutral if we're the test taker. We might ask individuals to rate their preferences or their responses based on semantic differential. And so we've got two things that rest in binaries here: bad versus good, exciting versus boring, difficult versus easy. We remove, in a semantic differential scale, we remove any sort of neutral, we remove any sort of gradient between one side or the other. Things are either bad or they're good. Again, we have checklists, and we ask individuals to rank order items. But we might even ask them to rank order items based on their perception of the importance. So here we have a rank order scale. And so there's a possibility that we can create a rank order approach, but still using a scale. And you might think, well, how is this different from Likert type? It's about that there's a specific rank order to these things, and we're asking individuals to indicate that type of rank order. When it comes to constructing questionnaires, there is a series of steps involved, and Macmillan goes through these, but I want to put them on the screen just to talk about them very briefly, and so that you've got this visual as you're watching the video and kind of thinking about Chapter 7. And this is a lengthy list of a checklist. We're going to revisit this when we have an activity later in the semester. I think it's in week 13, where we're going to construct a survey, or each of you are going to construct some survey items related to your MRP topic. And so we're going to revisit this list at that time, and I'm going to remind you of this and ask you to evaluate each other's works based on this list. When it comes to administering questionnaires, the internet has become a very useful tool to help us administer surveys. And you might see them referenced as web-based, online, or electronic surveys. And you've probably received a survey request from SurveyMonkey, maybe Inquisit, or possibly Qualtrics. One of the benefits of using an online approach to survey administration is that it saves time and money. There's no issue with reliability or validity because it's the same instrument. It's just delivered in a different format. And an online approach to survey usage or survey administration helps us get greater access to a wider range of participants at greater distances. But there are some disadvantages. Online surveys have a traditionally low response rate when compared to their paper-based cousins. So then that begs the question, what's a typical response rate for paper-based versus online-based surveys? When I was going through my doc program, I worked for my dissertation advisor as a grad assistant for a year, and he was a big quantitative guy and was administering a survey, and he did a paper-based survey, and we talked about he kind of talked through with me the considerations between paper-based and online. And he said that generally with a paper-based survey, we're probably going to hope to get a return rate of 40% from all that we send out. And I think that seems pretty low. So let's say that I select a sample of 100 people. At best, I'm going to hope for 40 of those to come back. And what we've seen with online surveys even though we have access to a wider audience, we might even be able to construct a little bit larger sample because of the wider audience, and we can cast a bigger net. We're only going to see about a 20% return rate, or 20 to 25%. So in that same scenario of a sample of 100, we might see 20 to 25 of those come back. This becomes very problematic because with a lower return rate, we're going to have a less, I don't want to say reliable because I don't want to get that confused with the reliability of measures, but we're going to have a smaller effect size. We're going to have a response. We're not going to be able to really have as much usability from the responses that we get. So generally with survey research, particularly when using online approaches to administering surveys, we're going to construct a larger sample, and so that by the time we get our response rate of 20 to 25%, we're hopefully going to have a more robust number of responses to use in our analysis. McMillan spent some time talking about interviews and observations. We're going to come back to interviews and observations when we talk about qualitative data collection. I'm not a big fan of the way that McMillan addresses interviews and observations. As a qualitative researcher myself, that's generally where I find my work and where I align myself. I don't like the notion of reducing that richness of qualitative data into some type of numerical value. So McMillan talked about some problems with measuring non-cognitive traits. And one of the issues is that when compared to cognitive measures, we typically have lower reliability and validity. And that largely comes as a result of asking about people's attitudes, values, and opinions. And as McMillan notes, attitude can mean many different things. One of the issues that we also see is a response set. If someone starts down a page and starts with clicking on always neutral or always agree or strongly agree, they're probably going to continue in a pattern of picking that same response because they get used to clicking in the same part of the screen. Then we also have a degree of social desirability, or even wanting to please the researcher. Maybe it's somebody sends out an email, says, hey, I'm working on my master's thesis and I need help with gathering data, and it's a survey that's of a non-cognitive measure, and the respondents might say, I want to help this student out. I want to make sure they get good data, and click strongly agree all the way down. And so we get some results that when we then measure reliability, we possibly get a lower reliability score. Because one of the things that the software can do for us is it picks up on patterns like that. And so a patterned response, or just a straight down response, which is generally what patterned responses references, gets picked up in the software, and it brings the reliability score down. And I'm going to post this image on Canvas. I think it's helpful, but also I'm not going to post it for this week, largely because when we talk about qualitative research, I want to make sure that we distinguish very clearly the differences between a questionnaire and an interview. So this was a little bit longer video. I hope you stuck with it, with me all the way through it. And if you have any questions, please make sure that you reach out, let me know, post them in a discussion forum, whatever it is.